very much. This very enjoyable talk. And when you were giving the talk, I was thinking about the Japan's case.
Yeah.
And, they tried several times about the so-called unconventional monetary policy and didn't seem very successful. And this is my first question. How do your simple model can, try to explain the Japanese case? And the second question is, when you say the, QE or something, that your model seems to me, I may miss it, about the transmission mechanism, the monetary transmission mechanism problem. That is, how your model account kind of, if the whole monetary system is not in the right place, the condition, not very efficient, then how effective is the monetary policy? Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, let me answer that. First, the Japan case. I don't obviously have a final answer. I remember I was actually, before I joined the Bank of Finland, I was a consultant in the Bank of Japan, in fact. This is a long time ago, so I can tell, obviously I hadn't done so much research at that moment. This was 2007. But one thing which was interesting I learned was that they also tried fiscal remedies, but they were kind of cautious, didn't want to do too much and so forth. Whereas if you believe this approach, it tells you that, you have to have, decisive action, potentially significant level in the increase in government spending, but for a limited period. And they were kind of timid, doing it slowly and maybe for a longer period. And there was actually a big debate in Japan, I remember, sort of around 2005 and just before, saying that, they are doing too little in the wrong sort of way. And it didn't work then. And so the fiscal policy. The monetary policy is a tougher one to answer. They had tried, again, relatively cautious, very cautious. The first QE program about 15 years ago was a very cautious, small one. It's not surprising it didn't work in some sense. Then in 2007, they were, when I was there, I can tell you this anecdote. I always received the question, how do we get out of this? And I said that, it looks like maybe monetary policy is not going to be enough. You would have to somehow get both the fiscal and monetary policies in place. Obviously, that I didn't discuss anything that was joined here, but obviously that would increase the chances to get out. And I think that's still the case. I think this is something worth considering. As I said, we haven't done the analysis properly, even in this simple framework yet. But it's clear that would help. That would help. The transmission mechanism. I think the issue here is in the assumption about the Ricardian consumers, because the financial variables don't affect the consumption, and so the alternative would be to put them in. As I said, we have done one part of it, which is in that one paper I mentioned, where yes, it can be a helpful thing, the real balance effects in deflations, but obviously there can be some other effects, which is that if the financial crisis means that the perception of financial wealth of consumers goes down, that's going to influence adversely consumption. And so all of these different aspects should be analyzed. So I'm careful. I was careful, I think, to say that these are not in this current story. But I think this was giving us some important aspect, which is that let's take the two steady states, be careful about that, and then realize that this means that the target is not always the one to look at. There are other situations to look at. And that's, I think, the basic message here, which comes even in the simple story. But there are a lot is missing.
Okay, Professor Ma.
I think in one of your slides, you mentioned, interestingly, irresponsible policy may address current situation. Right. You didn't follow this logic analysis. Now, if we look at the U.S. president election, the leading Republican candidate, Donald Trump, do you think he will introduce this kind of radical policy?
Well, I better not comment on the presidential candidates. But let me comment on this irresponsible policy. I mean, this was very much in the early, the literature in the early 2000s, which was the idea that, somehow because we have the two steady states that in that basic figure, And if you do the dynamics, it was basically what was happening is that because it's a rational expectation model, it's a forward-looking model, that normal steady state is something what they refer to as locally determinate. So you go instantly there. This is the power of rational expectations. But then they pointed out that if you move somewhat away from that steady state and somehow put in conditions, so there are very complicated cyclical paths that go to the low steady state. And so there's that one steady state and then these complicated paths and that go to the second low steady state. So the question is, how do we devise a policy, a fiscal policy or monetary policy that makes sure that low steady state is not a long-run equilibrium? And that's what these papers said. And they basically said that, okay, we're gonna spend, and the government plans to spend for a period so much, it looks like the intertemporal budget constraint is not going to be. They basically say that we are irresponsible, we just spend, and the intertemporal budget constraint is not going to be satisfied. Well, that's going to mean that the low steady state is not going to be a proper steady state. And then agents revise their behavior. They realize this. They're very, even though this is a story about the asymptotic, they realize this. And then the only thing that's left is the target equilibrium. There is no story, everything happens in their minds. They do this complicated calculation that the low steady state doesn't exist, and then obviously the dynamic paths towards it, which are equilibria, do not exist either. They don't, and then the only thing that's left is the normal steady state. And this happens in their mind right away, and then you just go with that. That's the rational expectation story, somewhat sort of extremely characterized, but that is effectively what it is. And so by promising to be, effectively is that by promising to be irresponsible fiscally, then you just avoid the mess. And then people just believe, try to think, reason this through and reason properly through and correctly through, and they realize those are not going to be equilibria. There's just one thing left, and they believe that, and there the economy goes. So I think that tells that why I don't believe in that story. It's a theoretical curiosum.
Yeah, please.
So from the perspective of your model, it seems that monetary policy is not effective when you're in a very pessimistic kind of equilibrium. Fiscal policy seems to be more efficacious in that state. So from the viewpoint of EU, can we regard your paper as giving a theoretical justification for why a fiscal union of some form may be important in the EU area going forward?
Okay, let me first on the monetary policy is that there are situations where especially the pure interest rate policy, Taylor rule, is insufficient, can get you into trouble, and shocks have taken you a situation where it is in trouble. And then QE, at least in this simple setting, has limitations. One could think of other things maybe which we haven't looked at. But somehow you have to do something more with the monetary policy and fairly extreme things. And that in general terms, that's exactly what the situation is. In the euro system, ECB is asked to do a lot, has a lot of responsibility, keeps the economy in reasonable, tries to keep it in, obviously with the acute crisis it is, but even now with you have to defend the system somehow not to get into the deflation region. And I think that's quite a sensible thing for ECB to try to do, but the measures are becoming very extreme. There are still measures available, but then they are not going to be easy measures in this. So then the other question I think is what about fiscal policies? Well, it doesn't, it would be nice to, obviously in some sense if you could move to the fiscal union, in some sense then that simplifies the decision making about the fiscal policies. The trouble of course in Europe and in particular euro area is that the countries are in very different situations. There are a few countries, in particular Germany, but some other country where the fiscal situation is either good or reasonably good, and which could have somewhat more expansionary fiscal policy. Germany probably could have a lot. Then, of course, this just saying it because of the of avoiding liquidity trap. for using fiscal policy is obviously a simplistic view. We should ask, what about public? Public investments are often mentioned, but maybe one should also look at the quality of the public investments, and so there are other additional considerations there. In practice, of course, the decision making is more difficult. That we don't have a fiscal union. Fiscal policy is national responsibility. However, in the Great Recession, the European countries also achieved very quickly, relatively quickly, a consensus on that, yes, there's going to be a fiscal expansion, and they even acknowledged that, okay, a few countries have a major banking crisis, which is going to cost a lot to the taxpayers, and they were given sort of they said that you don't have to have otherwise a big fiscal expansion, and other countries did. So I think elements of these can be done. The trouble, of course, if you don't have, if the current decision-making structure is complicated, and unless you have an acute crisis, it's difficult to get a good consensus out of it. That's my own thinking on this.
Okay, I have a question that ties together a couple of the earlier ones.
Right.
And when you think about irresponsible fiscal policy, isn't Japan the poster child for that? I mean, you've got this massive debt level, which clearly cannot be paid off, and yet maybe because it's a non-rational equilibrium world, or maybe a non-Ricardian world, that this hasn't actually had the effect you'd be looking at to push them out of below equilibrium. I mean, why is the bad equilibrium still an equilibrium in Japan, given the massive level of the debt?
Who knows? I don't know. I mean, one would have to know the views of the Japanese consumers more. Of course, the important thing we have to realize is that in Japan it's all domestic debt, and that makes things a little bit different from if the country had foreign debts. Because the domestic debts, you can maybe do some tricks at some stage if needed, whereas with foreign debts you normally have to pay them. And so I think so. But again, since I was dealing with Ricardian consumers, I can't really answer that part very well. But they have clearly tried the expansion a lot. As I said, it was somewhat timid in earlier years of this, but now most recently again they are trying, but not very much on the fiscal side. That is more limited. They are trying a lot on the asset purchase program and QE in Japan. So they are again relying on the central bank very heavily, and by this, the central bank is, they are, spending a fair amount of money, and if this continues, I don't know, another 5-10 years, most of the public debt will be in the central bank, and that's an interesting situation. Then you can perhaps consider some accounting tricks on this or something. I don't know what will happen. It would need to be analyzed more carefully.
So what problems arise having a negative interest rate policy?
Well, there are, it's, I didn't discuss it in terms of the model, but then this is what a few countries, including the euro area, are trying now. So what it means, effectively what we've seen is that in practice you can have slightly negative rates for the central bank to set. And of course, some of the bond yields also have gone negative a little bit negative in some countries like Germany or Finland as well. In this situation, the potential problems of negative interest rates, and I must say that I'm not a great fan of them, but in the extreme situation, maybe one has to try these. Is that first of all, maybe we don't want to encourage too much saving in this current situation, but it obviously is it's a disincentive to saving to have negative rates. On the other, it's an incentive to borrow more and spend it, or potentially you can either spend it on consumption or you can buy assets, paper assets, bonds, whatever, and that's it. There is clearly a risk of the latter, which is that private agents start to borrow more, and they spend it on purchases of financial instruments rather than the real economy. Because the problem is the real economy. The real economic activity level is low, and I'm not sure that this incentive to spend more by negative rates goes to the real economy necessarily. Somehow this thing is maybe locked act in a more serious way. And then, of course, some further things which are potentially problematic is that you know, these negative rates means that you are squeezing the banks, because banks will not easily pass these rates, especially to consumers. You know, if they start to say that, okay, your deposit earns a negative interest rate in the bank, then the consumers, even if it's a small negative rate, we don't know for sure, but it's likely, it's possible certainly that you know, consumers start to withdraw the money, in particular if it becomes a bit more negative than what currently is. I've seen a few banks propose to corporations possibly a slightly negative rate. So this is, you know, this is an issue which is coming if these negative rates continue, and especially if they may go a little bit more negative, and especially if they do, then these issues come. So banks' margins are squeezed. Obviously, you know, lending rates are still positive, but they have gotten lower. So banks' margins are squeezed. The question is, can they then finance lending if they can only charge low rates with the negative rates? that might be a thing to do, but I don't think they can at the moment. So there are, you know, there are various tensions in the financial system because of the negative rates. Similarly, pension funds, which usually hold government bonds and possibly corporate bonds, if the yields go very low, then these assets are not very good for pensioners, for longer term saving, and that's another potential hazard. These have not been studied systematically, I believe. You know, how big are the effects on banks, on pension funds, and so forth. But this is the discussion that's going on at the moment.
Okay. Other question? Yeah, please.
Thank you so much for the lecture. Actually, I am Japanese, and I'm studying about the negative interest rate.
Okay.
So I think, as you say, our country is trying the best to do the negative interest rates to recover the economy. However, I think because we experienced the bubble in 1980s, and the corporation seems to hold their money, and the regular consumers, they are not feeling that the economy is recovering. So, and also next year, the government decided to raise the tax again. Mm-hmm. So, what we can, I think, what we have to think about the next things to make the economy better, and if you can suggest something.
Right. Well, I better not suggest anything concrete on that because I would have to study things much more carefully. But yeah, I mean, this is certainly an interesting set of issues. In Japan is one of the countries where the negative rates are in place. What they have been doing, I believe, in Japan is that there's kind of a fair amount of the deposit that the private bank has put into the central bank actually does not pay a negative rate. It's only towards the margin where it's so actually the rates are not charged on the total amounts that but you know, we see and we also in the euro system we have countries, banks which are outside the euro system also as our counterparties, and some of them deposit a lot of money to us, and they get paid negative rates. So it is an unusual situation. We don't quite know what's going to happen here. But what you do see, of course, by this and maybe by the other monetary policy measures as well, we don't quite know which measure does what, is that the interest rates on new corporate loans and interest rates on household borrowing have gone down significantly, and borrowing is up. In the euro area, both of these borrowing, household borrowing and corporate borrowing, were negative. And now household borrowing has been positive, on the positive increase for several months already, and the corporate borrowing, I think it's just gone positive in growth rate. So we are seeing these effects coming. But I think the really tough question is this is this situation that we are in this kind of a pessimistic situation where, as you said, corporations are not optimistic. They don't want to invest and so forth because they see great uncertainties in the financial system, but also possibly concerning their product demands. Or maybe obviously some companies are doing well. We know there are some good success stories even nowadays. But overall, it's not a very encouraging situation, and it has become the economy has become stuck in this. And so the question is how to get out of that.
Any other question? So, please.
I just wonder, for the bigger picture, like for the U.S., has the U.S. got the ability to increase the interest rate now? And what will happen to the rest of the world, EU, when the U.S. increase the interest rate? Will it actually put EU in a worse position than now?
Well, we don't obviously, and I don't want to comment on the other central banks. That's a practice among central bankers. We don't, especially in public, we don't comment. But this will be filmed, so maybe I have to be careful here. But so, in some sense, they have increased the interest rate once. There is talk that they might do it again. We don't know how often this year, for example, and so forth. But that's their tendency, and understandably so, because the economy has been relatively healthy growth, and they have still a somewhat low inflation, but the core inflation is higher, and so you could argue maybe that there's scope for increase, and they might do that. For us, actually, we wouldn't mind. I think the euro system wouldn't mind. We are in different stages. U.S. has been on the recovery for much longer than we are. The euro area has started to recover in terms of positive GDP growth since 2013. And so we have just a few years of recovery. United States, once they got out of the Great Recession and got into, they've had positive growth ever since. So they are in a very different stage, and with the sort of growth rates that they have, you could argue that maybe the situation is getting more normal. And we've been seeing, most recently, we've been also seeing some of the concerns that they had, like labor force participation rate, that has started to increase as well. So those are the signs.
Okay, so it's time to close this talk and the conclusion. Thank you very much.